there is a kind of attraction to totalitarian thinking that can exist in most brains, because most brains do want that really irresistible logic that ideologies give us. And we do like rules, we do like rituals. Some of us like them more than others, which is why some of us will, when a totalitarian ideology comes along, some of us will rush to join it and others will be more skeptical. But what's important to realize is that that pull is there. And that's why I've, in the book, thought a lot about what does it mean for each person to create a kind of resilience against that temptation.
Welcome to a new episode of Dichtung und Wahrheit, a podcast dedicated to the authors of German publishing houses Suhrkamp and Insel. My name is Annika von Taube. I moderate this podcast. Our conversations are usually in German, however, sometimes in English, depending on our guests. And with us today is Leor Zmigrod, a political psychologist and pioneer in political neuroscience, who investigates why some people are susceptible to extreme ideologies and dogmatic thinking and others not. What constitutes the ideological brain? This is the title of her book, which does not just look at the factors that might foster radicalization and ideological behavior. It is actually also an invitation for us, the readers, to check our own way of thinking and to cherish flexibility of thinking and open-mindedness. The ideological brain is now available in German, titled Das ideologische Gehirn. And we took the opportunity to catch up with the author while on book tour in Germany. And we're very happy to have her with us here today. Welcome, Leor Zmigrod.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Leor, your book just came out and it's already a huge success. It has been translated into I don't know how many different languages already. Do you actually know yourself?
I think it's over 15.
Wow. So your book is actually turning into something like a world citizen. I'm, of course, referring to a little episode in your book where you yourself describe yourself as such a world citizen. And I was wondering, how important is it for the brain to have an actual place to call home, or is the brain actually born a world citizen?
Wow, what a great, beautiful question. Because in many ways, our brains are very tuned to identities, right? We want to have a sense of belonging. We want to feel connected with others. We want to understand who we are. And that's what national identities, geographical identities often give us. But they can also sometimes lead us astray because we can sometimes get overfixated on those kind of strict, narrow identities. And then we treat ourselves and others in a less fluid way. We treat each other more judgmentally. So I think that for the brain, it might be tempting to hold on to national identities, but actually it can also, be a bit misleading for us sometimes.
Would you say your brain is... So you won't say your brain is a world citizen, right?
I would say that I do think of my identities as quite fluid. And I think that doing this research, looking at the impact of having very rigid ideological identities on the brain, has maybe also encouraged me to think very critically about what identities I hold dear. And in many ways, the book is an invitation for people to think, well, should I be embracing these identities imposed from the outside so passionately, or would I rather construct a more authentic, individual blend of different cultural kind of dimensions?
But let's start with your interest in the human brain in general. What sparked this interest?
Yeah, I was always really fascinated by the human brain, by human behavior, and I went to Cambridge to study psychology and neuroscience. And as I was doing these experiments initially I started on the neuroscience of free will. I was really interested in what the brain looks like when it makes a free, spontaneous decision that is, originates from within, and how that looks different to when decisions and choices are imposed from the outside, when we're actually making forced instructions rather than our own spontaneous free choices. And so I was really interested in the neuroscience of free will, and that kind of naturally led me to asking questions about the neuroscience of unfreedom and why some people might choose to voluntarily join ideologies that erase their freedoms and that take away their mental flexibility.
And now, as I said in the intro, you're considered a pioneer in the field of political neuroscience. So that must be a new emergent scientific discipline. So you have to explain to us what it actually is, what it entails, how it works.
Yes, most people wouldn't expect to hear the words politics and neuroscience in one phrase.
Although social neuroscience has been around for a while, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But what we can now do in this new field of political neuroscience is really ask, how can we use the methods of neuroimaging, of experimental psychology and cognition, even genetics, to study why some people are prone to taking political ideologies to an extreme direction, or why some people gravitate towards the left versus the right. And what's really exciting about this new field is it shows us these invisible processes that we previously couldn't tell about what happens to a brain when it's indoctrinated into an ideology. And we can now see that and see very exciting things that I think should really make us rethink our relationships to ideologies.
And what I find very exciting about what you do is that you actually need to work with real human beings. It's not just great theory. You have to work with people, otherwise you can't do your work. So how did you source the participants of your experiments, the tests you performed on them or with them?
Always we want to work with participants.
Yeah.
Right?
But you know that when I hear the word neuroscience, many people associate it with, they stick sensors and weird electrodes into people's brains and make brain scans and do weird things to them. There's this weird perception about what is neuroscience.
Yes, that's true. And in many ways, it sometimes can feel like neuroscience is an almost invasive kind of look into the brain, into things we can't control. But actually, it doesn't only have to have those negative connotations, because it's a way for us to observe these kinds of unconscious processes that are happening inside our brains. And what we can do, and what I've done in my research in order to get these big numbers of participants, right? Because we want to do science that involves a huge number of participants.
Yeah. What number are we talking? Can you?
Thousands. Yeah.
Thousands
of participants. Yeah, because it's important when you build a new science that it's as robust as you can make it. And so I've done several different techniques. Sometimes I recruit people online to participate in these studies, and that way we can recruit people in all corners of the earth.
Right, but how do you approach them? And you can't ask people, hey, are you an ideological thinker? Do you believe in extremist? Are you about to commit an extremist act? Would you like to participate in my study? How do you do it?
Yeah, because actually what I'm interested in is everybody. Because when we take a big enough sample, then what we see is that some people will naturally be more extreme, more radical in their worldviews, even though they might not know it. And other people will be a lot more resistant to kind of authoritarian worldviews. And so what's interesting is if you take 1,000 people, you'll naturally typically already have that distribution of some people who are extreme, some people who aren't. And so often I've used these online methods where people join online. This can be through kind of specific platforms to source participants, people who want to participate in different kinds of experiments or surveys. Sometimes there are other less traditional methods, like telling people. I once went on BBC Radio and said, I'm running this study. If anybody wants to go on this link, and you might be able to join and kind of play the games. Because often, actually, a big part of the research I do is asking people to do these neuropsychological games, these tasks that allow us to measure their unconscious learning, their unconscious behavioral patterns and thinking patterns. And to do that, I ask them to play these kinds of games where they are typically moving shapes on a screen. We can talk about some of these games and what those experiments look like.
I would like to ask you to give us an example of one of these tests.
Yes. So one test that really looks at cognitive flexibility, at the kind of how wide and imaginative a person's thinking can be, how flexibly they can switch between modes of thinking, is actually a creativity task. And to do this, I ask participants a very simple kind of little game where I tell them about a normal object, like a mug or a brick, and I ask them to spend a few minutes and give me all the possible ideas they could have for how they could use that brick, for instance. And I tell them it can be an unconventional use, a conventional use, it can be wild, it can be very mundane. Any idea will do. Just take time and write down all your ideas. And what's interesting is that just from the simple kind of creativity imagination task, we can get a lot of information about people's responses. Because you can have one person who just starts this game and they start telling me, okay, yeah, you can build a house with a brick. You can use a brick to build a garden shed or a school or a castle. And they will give me 15 different ideas.
How to how to create a building with a brick. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So they might be very intelligent in that they'll have many ideas. But as you can see, all their ideas are very narrow. They're sticking to one kind of form, one kind of function, and they're not thinking more widely than that. But a different person, a more cognitively flexible person, might say, yes, you can build a house with a brick, but you can also use it as a paperweight. Or you can use it to keep a door open. Or you can use it to crush garlic. And one person once told me you can use it to feed a brick-eating monster.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
So what you can see in that person is when they're imagining, they're really switching between different modes of thinking, different mental tracks. And what I'm interested in is that both hypothetical people might have given me the same number of ideas. They both might have a similar kind of intelligence, but one is thinking more narrowly and one has a much more diverse way of approaching of thought. And that's just one kind of experiment where, as you can see, a person doesn't know what I'm measuring, right? They're just giving their spontaneous responses, but we can see the quality, the nature of their imagination, their thinking style. And what I found in my experiments is that people's thinking style on this kind of game is really related to their ideological beliefs.
So you basically made out two types. I mean, obviously things are much more complex than that, but sometimes you have to simplify. You made out two types of brains, or thinking modes, the narrow-minded, rigid thinking type and the flexible, open-minded thinking type. And with the narrow-minded one being more prone to falling for ideological ideas. What are some of the other characteristics of these two types?
So what we can see is when we start to understand that, I mean, there are two types, but they're actually sitting on a spectrum, a continuum, right? So all of us lie somewhere on this continuum. Some of us are much more rigid thinkers, others are much more flexible. And what we find is that this really parallels how dogmatic, how ideological people tend to think and how prone they are to thinking in extreme ways. And that maps onto this spectrum of how extreme or whether you're willing to think pluralistically in an evidence-based way. And so what's interesting to me is to look at those relationships between people's cognition, even their biology, their emotional habits, and see what makes some people more likely to be extreme and others more likely to be resistant to those kinds of ideologies that are closed. And one of the patterns that I think is really interesting is that actually when we look at the political spectrum and we look at people's political leanings, what we actually find is that when we map people's cognitive flexibility to their political identities, the people on the extreme ends, the far right and the far left, tend to be the most cognitively rigid on these kinds of tasks. And people who are more moderate, more independent, more suspicious of those pre-established political identities, they tend to be the most flexible. And we can also start to see what other kinds of traits people have when they're more extreme or when they're more more moderate or more, sometimes moderate has a connotation of like a centrist. But that's not exactly what we mean. It means more of a kind of a sense that your identity is not entirely fused with this group or political social identity, that you can see a differentiation between you, the individual, and the beliefs, the political ideologies that you might follow.
Let's return for a bit to how you sourced your participants, and because you just talked about political identity. And when I talk about children, I don't necessarily associate children with having a political identity. Did you also work with children or grown-ups only?
So a lot of the research is done with grown-ups, but actually I've also looked at a lot of research that works with children. And one of my kind of academic I don't know if to say heroes. But inspirations.
Icons.
Inspirations was this amazing psychologist called Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, who is kind of a forgotten hero of political psychology. She started her career in Vienna in the 1930s, and she managed to escape the Nazism as it was rising, and she escaped in 1938 to Berkeley. And she was really interested in the origin of prejudice. And she thought that perhaps we could even ask children about their prejudices, about their political opinions, which might initially seem absurd, right? Like, what do children know of politics?
Exactly, yes.
But actually, what she did was then once she arrived in California, she interviewed hundreds and thousands of Californian children between ages 9 to 13. And she was interested in their attitudes towards minority groups, the ones that were relevant to Californian children in the 40s. And what she found is that you could really see, children who had much more prejudiced, xenophobic attitudes, and others who are more tolerant, more liberal in that sense. And she had the suspicion that perhaps you could also connect their level of prejudice to their thinking styles, to how they solve different puzzles, different problems, and also to their home environment. And so she did these huge studies with interviews with children. And in the book, I look at some of the language that these children use, because it's almost a little shocking when you see these children that are able to say very authoritarian things.
I read some of that and it was shocking. It was chilling, actually.
Yes, it is. It is. And it's also almost a little crazy to think that it was so long ago. And yet there are echoes to similar social, political problems. And so it's a really fascinating thing. And she asked this very provocative question of what makes a potential fascist. A very chilling question in itself. But she came at it with this very holistic way. And she started thinking, well, what psychological traits might push these children, or some of these children, towards more authoritarian ways of thinking. And by that I mean ways of thinking that focus on conformity, on obedience, rather than on free imagination and free play. And she really started to find amazing things, but tragically her life was kind of curtailed short. And so her work didn't get as much recognition as it should have, as also has happened to many other women scientists in our history. But I guess 70 years later, I picked up her work and I thought, well, maybe we could use the tools of cognitive science, of neuroscience, to really develop this further and build on it. And that's where I then continued.
Just one more question on that. Did you rediscover her work, or in the scientific circles, is it widely known?
It's not widely known, but it exists. So what's interesting is she had some students who then went on to do influential work. And so some people only stop at looking at what those students of hers said. But then when you look back at her own work, it's clearly the foundation for all of it. And one of the most interesting historical things that's actually also very linked to some major German thinkers is that many people who've studied some politics or philosophy have heard of the Frankfurt School, the school of thinkers, including Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, these thinkers many of them who escaped to America and continued to develop these ideas about, in many ways, ideology and authoritarianism and fascism. So it was a bit of an obsession for everyone. And so towards the end of the 40s, she wrote this book together with Theodor Adorno, very, very famous thinker, called The Authoritarian Personality, or maybe in German it's more The Authoritarian Character.
Yes.
And he was the first author, she was the second, and there were two other colleagues. But from history's point of view, people only remember Adorno. And you say Adorno's the authoritarian personality. But actually, all of the ideas seemed to me so clearly to be hers. From the beginning, she was running these experiments, doing a quantitative analysis, and Adorno was not a quantitative analyst at all. In fact, he was a bit suspicious of empirical science and how it could, influence our philosophical thinking about ideologies. And so he never did anything like that before, and he never did anything afterwards in this vein. And so I think she's really been under-recognized. And so it was important for me to bring her back to our consciousness.
I love that. One thing you frequently cite her and refer to her work throughout the book. And one other thing you frequently refer to, or you keep stating the importance of, is the so-called hen and egg problem that I think everybody has heard about. And you say the way the brain functions can create a predisposition for ideological thinking, but conversely, an ideology can actually have an impact on the brain. And I was wondering, you as a scientist, do you just accept this rule, the hen and egg problem, or is it a bit frustrating not to know what came first and what influences what and how the mutual... I would be so frustrated.
Yeah. I think for me it's actually motivating.
Yeah.
Because it's a kind of puzzle.
Yes, it is
it's
a puzzle.
Kind of mystery.
Yeah.
Because it's the question of whether our psychology, even our biology, influences our ideology. Or is it possible that being immersed in an ideology can be an experience that might literally shape our brains, our bodies, our personalities? And so sometimes it feels difficult to crack, but I think it can motivate really great science because it forces us to think about causality, right? About what is it about some people's brains, their personalities, their thinking habits, even their genetics and physiology that might push them to extreme ideologies, but also really understanding that there might be actually deep consequences to engaging with an ideology in a radical way, that it can shape our bodies. And I think that that's quite a, it can be a scary, troubling idea, but I think it's important for us to understand because that should really force us to reckon with, there's a big decision here, that our ideologies are not just things that are battles, conflicts in the public sphere and for politicians to battle it out. Those battles occur within our bodies.
As you mentioned, you looked into so many different factors, genetic factors, epigenetic, social factors, and so on. And one factor, which in fact you mentioned when you briefly described this experiment, you said it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. And that got me thinking because I would usually associate a high level of intelligence with a flexible thinker, whereas I would think of a narrow-minded, rigid thinker as not being the smartest cookie in the jar, So why do I have this perception, this understanding of intelligence and IQ scores?
Yes, and I think it's very common. And often we think, well, like in psychology, we would say intelligence, we call that often cognitive ability, just your general cognitive capacities, And you would think that flexibility feeds into that you need both. But actually, we measure them separately. And I've seen that even when I control for IQ, all of the patterns that we see still exist. So they are true regardless of your level of intelligence. Sometimes high intelligence can sometimes compensate a little bit. So sometimes intelligence, if you're very high intelligence, even if you're a bit rigid in your thinking, you might still then not be too dogmatic. You might still be open to thinking about alternative perspectives. You might still be open to hearing potential evidence, and you might be willing to change your beliefs when evidence suggests that you should change your beliefs. But broadly, it's important, I think, to realize that, it's not all about intelligence, and actually you can be very intelligent, but very rigid, and that might still put you at high risk of joining an ideological group and trying to advance it.
And what about curiosity? as a scientist, obviously you possess curiosity. There are professions like yours, artists, engineers, like they need curiosity. They need to love being, venturing into the unknown and play with uncertainty and be okay with, not knowing and not being certain about things, which is actually something, as you describe in your book, is something the brain doesn't like too much, right? It wants to make predictions and it wants those predictions to be true because, of course, it doesn't want to send its human into dangerous situations. And I'm wondering, is curiosity maybe a characteristic that you can only find in open-minded thinkers?
I think the way I see curiosity as being linked is that it's linked to something we call intellectual humility. And intellectual humility is the opposite of dogmatism.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Because when you're intellectually humble, you are open, curious about alternative perspectives. You're willing to hear them out. You don't feel under personal attack when someone believes something different to you. And what you're able to do when you're intellectually humble, and I think that comes together with curiosity, is that you're not overconfident about your beliefs. You're not intellectually arrogant.
Oh, yeah, you have to be able to endure doubt, right?
Exactly, exactly. You have to be able to have doubt and skepticism, but also not fall prey to being too persuadable, right? So I think that curiosity is part of that middle path that allows you to be humble, where you're not just thinking, okay, you have access to all the truth and all kind of authority and you don't need to hear anyone else. No, you're still curious and open to evidence, to other information, but you're not so persuadable that curiosity turns into a way to control you.
Yeah, I love that. So let's talk a bit about the concept of ideology, because this is something I think we all know what ideology is, yeah? But we don't necessarily know about the origin of this concept and the evolution of ideology. The understanding of this term has changed so dramatically. So could you please just very briefly, of course, try to give us a very brief history of the concept of ideology?
Yeah, it's actually an almost unexpected history because we use the word ideology, but sometimes we don't realize that it sounds like biology or zoology or all those other
ologies.
All those other ologies, yeah, all those other disciplines, these pursuits of knowledge. And that's because when the word ideology was first invented, it was meant actually to be a science of ideas. And this French thinker towards the end of the 1700s called Count Tracy, he was actually stuck in a prison cell because of the reign of terror. And he was this aristocrat, this philosophe who really was interested in the nature of ideas, how we come to have ideas. And he had this vision that maybe we can study it scientifically. Rather than leaning on religious orthodoxies, on superstition, we could have a science of how our brains, minds form ideas, how they sense the world, and how they reason about the world. And so he had this vision that we could create this new science and that it would be both an empirical kind of endeavor and also an educative one. That in schools and universities, people would learn ideology in the same way that they learn, chemistry, biology, and that way they would sharpen their reasoning skills. What happened next is that when Napoleon was pursuing power in France at the same time, he didn't like this mission, the idea of ideology, because he wanted people to continue to believe in hierarchies of power, in religious authorities, in political authorities, in his own authority. And to ask people to understand where their rational ideas come from and refine them was completely against his needs for power. This might remind us of certain things that are happening now, with political leaders wanting to reduce educational resources in order to maintain their own power. But anyways, and so Napoleon started saying, those ideologists, as like an insult. It turned from a scientific mission into a kind of, pejorative insult that you threw at someone who believed something different to you. This later turned in the hands of Marx and Engels into a completely different notion that actually ideology is kind of a set of oppressive illusions that distance you from yourself. And the humanities, for the last 100 years, have been debating about what exactly is ideology. Is it just political attitudes, as maybe that's kind of the way in which we talk about it now? Or is it more of a set of oppressive illusions that people hold? And so there are still those competing understandings, even between people. So we use the word ideology a lot. We rarely know its history, but we also don't always agree on what it is. And we also don't always agree on whether it's a good or a bad thing. Some people say, well, yeah, actually, ideology is essential for morality. You need to have moral values. You need to have an ideology. That way you will be principled, and that's how you will be a moral person, a good person in the world. Other people are more suspicious, and they say, no, actually, ideologies are, the things that make you follow illegitimate authority, rules, and forms of punishment against yourself and others that are very negative. So it's been fascinating to work in this space where people are coming at it with different definitions or assumptions about what ideology is. And I was interested in almost going back to the original mission of understanding ideology as the origins of ideas and thinking about what ideological thinking looks like. What does it look like from the perspective of the individual, rather than thinking about ideology as just those historical or political currents and movements that occur in society at a macro level. And instead, or not just instead, but in addition to, looking at what it means when a brain really internalizes an ideology.
There are also misconceptions about, as you point out in your book, about the people who believe in ideology. We tend to think of them as being brainwashed, remote controlled. They act in blind obedience. But as you point out, can't be the case because there's always a considerable amount of people who will not follow the rules and will not fall for things and will turn against it, actually. But why is it that I believe these people to be brainwashed?
I think because the image, even the language, right? We have the word brainwashed. And I think
I love that term, though.
Yes, it's an amazing term. And I've looked, and it's actually used in many languages. So it's taken hold as a really powerful metaphor.
Right. Hirnwäsche, also a very good German word, ma'am.
Yes. It's interesting. I think it's a very seductive image because I think it gives us a sense of something being erased in the person. And someone else doing it, right? When you're brainwashed, someone else is doing that to you. And I think that removes responsibility. And people often want to remove responsibility from a person who has been brainwashed, indoctrinated, radicalized, because it might be their friend, it might be their family member. And it's an almost easier, more convenient thing than to think, well, actually, they chose this. They have responsibility. They're free agents who are choosing to adopt these beliefs, and actually their brains are not being washed, but they're being changed in specific and profound ways. And that's a harder, more complicated image to deal with.
They're being changed, but are they all being changed equally if they're all subject to the same ideology? Because we frequently have this idea of, when I think of an ideology, I see a faceless mass of people, And they're all the same. It's like one body of... Yes. But
there's a kind of homogeneity to it, a kind of universality. They're all going through the same thing. But actually, through this research and these experiments, we see that not everyone is equally susceptible to the pull of ideology. And even amongst people who all would say identify with the same political label, there's huge variation. Some people will be more loose with their ideology, right? They will say, yes, I am nationalistic, but they will be, and I don't know if people will say they're nationalistic, but, they'll be kind of more maybe patriotic, people say, positive terms.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
But some people who, let's say, are patriotic will be very passionately patriotic. They will be very hostile to anyone who thinks differently. They will be willing to inflict violence on anyone who threatens their patriotic sentiments. Where others, they might feel some kind of love for their country, but that is not this complete exclusive love, and they will continue to see other people as equally valuable, equally human, even if they don't belong to that national category.
Now, looking at political ideology, we have far left views, far right views, moderate views. And as you point out, we see this worldwide in many countries that there are shifts and repositionings within an ideology. Conservatives can take on progressive views. Progressives will turn into traditionalists. The left is becoming the new right. The right is moving far right. I mean, there are so many shifts and repositionings. And I was wondering what that does to the ideological brain. Does it care about these shifts? How does it process that something has changed?
What a great question. I think that it really depends, because what can happen is someone who's committed to an ideology, but let's say politically, socially, in terms of policies and orientations, it becomes more and more extreme. By more and more extreme, I mean it becomes more hostile, more willing to engage with violence, more intolerant of anyone who thinks differently. We can see that with a lot of misogynistic ideologies. Young men who might have grown up in very tolerant homes, very liberal values, are suddenly, when they're now online, and they're given these online communities and influencers who give them answers about maybe their own personal grievances, but that start to entrench these very, very strong gender divides, that these huge assumptions that there are massive, irreconcilable differences, let's say, between the genders, and that it's a fight. And so what can happen, let's say, is a young person who starts to encounter that kind of ideology, and they, first of all, one of the big problems now, and why I think there are so many forms of extremism that continue to mutate, is that the way in which people are receiving information online is tuned exactly to make them more rigid thinkers, to make them more emotionally fearful, emotionally disgusted, emotionally threatened. And what happens when you put a vulnerable mind in that environment is that those traits that put them at risk will become amplified. And so they can more easily become radicalized and pushed. And so the ideological brain is definitely tuned to these tectonic shifts in how ideologies are marketed to people, because that's also the way in which people are now receiving information. It's a combination of information, entertainment, advertising.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking about marketing, we were going to ask you about that. Is there any difference between a political ideology and all these ubiquitous messages that we're receiving, all the social media trends, marketing, advertising?
I think they work kind of together. I think that so much of the personalized marketing that we receive tries implicitly to tap into the ideologies that we hold, the beliefs we hold about the world, what we value, what kind of products will give us satisfaction, a sense of status, for young people, older people, across the genders and everything. And so I think that the two are working to create a very toxic digital environment right now. And I think I'm very worried about that. Having studied the traits that make people susceptible to extreme ideologies, it feels like it's a very dangerous match with the way in which those algorithms are currently governing social media.
Right. I totally understand that. That makes sense. And what about other forms of extremism, such as lifestyle choices, extreme dieting, substance abuse, stuff like that? Does the brain work the same way in engaging with these forms of extremism?
I think it can. And that's why one of the things one of the results I'm most fascinated by is that it's not so much about what we're thinking about, but more about how we're thinking about it. So if we start having an extreme obsession, whether it's about a political issue, a social issue, or it's about a lifestyle thing, a particular diet, a particular exercise regime, both can become very rigid, very dogmatic, very passionate and intense kinds of devotion. What distinguishes an ideology from, let's say, when you become obsessed with a diet, is whether it has a few key components that make an ideology, which is, does it have a doctrine of some kind? It can be implicit or explicit. Basically a set of rules and prescriptions for how you should think, how you should act, how you should interact with other people. And some kinds of rigid behaviors do, right? When it's about dieting or exercise regimes, it can start to have very rigid rules. And if you don't follow those rules, you might think you need to be punished for it. Obviously, usually it's at a much more kind of moderate level, but it can be taken to an extreme. What it then would be missing is the social component that many ideologies have, right? Ideologies create those identities for us, give us those senses of who we belong to, who belongs to our group and who doesn't, who is an in-group or an out-group. And so when an extreme rigid obsession becomes an ideology is when it starts to create those identities where some people follow it and some people don't, and you demonize those who don't follow it or threaten your ideal or mission, and you only become friends with and appreciate people who do. And so anything can become an ideology, but it needs to have several components in order to have that particular logic that ideologies try to instill in the believers.
I'm still wondering if not even the most liberal and most flexible of free thinkers could fall for an ideology and take on extremist views or commit extremist acts, because, like I would never kill in the name of any god, but I can't say the same about, like, I don't know, my partner, my children. Maybe I would kill to protect them,
Yes. And that's, and often what ideologies do is they activate those family sentiments, right? So many ideologies use the language of leading father, leading mother, the motherland, fatherland. Comrades are like brothers in arms. So they use that language to make people feel like it's a family because, as you say, we often would sacrifice ourselves. We would do very extreme things to protect our family. And ideologies try to make us apply that format to much bigger groups of strangers.
Right. You quote there's a US-American philosopher, Eric Hoffer, and you say that, or he said that, like, even in the most peaceful of times, even in the most, like, liberal, democratic social structures, there's a totalitarian system in all of us. I didn't like that.
It's
but
not
is
a
it
happy
true?
thought. It's
No.
not a happy thought. I think that what he's getting at is that there is a kind of attraction to totalitarian thinking that can exist in most brains, because most brains do want that really irresistible logic that ideologies give us. And we do like rules. We do like rituals. Some of us like them more than others, which is why some of us will, when a totalitarian ideology comes along, some of us will rush to join it and others will be more skeptical. But what's important to realize is that that pull is there. And that's why I've, in the book, thought a lot about what does it mean for each person to create a kind of resilience against that temptation. And I think people can, and that's important because sometimes people think, oh, in the science you're showing all kinds of psychological, biological factors that push people towards ideologies. So maybe it's all predetermined. Maybe, it's in someone's destiny to become an extreme radical thinker and there's nothing they can do about it. But actually, my research shows that really people have a lot of choice, a lot of freedom, and people can change themselves. People can become more flexible thinkers. They can also become more rigid thinkers in stressful situations, in certain environments. And that's why, in order to battle that potential inner totalitarian that we have inside of us, I think one of the best ways to do that is to cultivate a kind of cognitive flexibility, a capacity to think in a very expansive way, a balanced way where we're receptive to evidence, we can tolerate some uncertainty, but we're still grounded in that balanced approach to life. And that's a struggle. That's not easy. But I think that the struggle is worth it.
Yeah, and I think this level of choice that we actually have is especially interesting considering how we start out in life. You compared infant education with like a totalitarian system, say, yeah, and then I was like, this is so true. Parents know everything about their children. They tell them what to do. They rule their entire life, when to eat, when to go to bed. They always know where they are. Yet we are under total surveillance when we grow up. And still we manage to, create our lives and build our worldviews and everything. That actually gave me hope.
I'm glad. Yeah.
It makes me feel stronger.
Yes.
I never thought about childhood that way.
Yes.
I never felt I was under control or anything, but I was. I was totally under control.
Of course. Of course. And it is empowering to realize that maybe you've already exited
Yes.
a kind of totalitarian dependence as you have matured and grown up and found independence.
Yeah. So given that we have this creative freedom, so to speak, you actually say it is possible to unlearn ideology?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you can go against the ideologies that you've learned. And in some of the research that I discuss in the book, I am really interested in people who have changed ideologies, people who have converted, people who either grew up in a very ideological, devout environment and left it, and also the other group of people, which is people who grew up with no ideology, with a kind of very tolerant, secular environment that was very loving, that wasn't too hierarchical, but actually chose to enter a hierarchical, more authoritarian ideology in later life. And I'm really interested in seeing those trajectories of change. And what it shows is that the best reflection of what direction we will go, rather whether we will enter an ideology or whether we will leave one, is our flexibility. Is the people who are incredibly flexible are the ones who typically leave ideological systems, and people who are most rigid, even if we compare them to people who have been in ideological systems their whole lives, if you weren't and then chose it voluntarily, you tend to be the most rigid thinker. Mm-hmm. And so it's really actually about not so much about our upbringing, but about our later choices. That what we choose to believe, what ideological systems we reject or we embrace, that's the best reflection of the kind of human mind that we have.
I'm still wondering, though, let's take an example. Mossab Hassan Youssef, the son of Hamas, super famous. He descended, left Hamas, lives in the States and educates the world about, the evil of Hamas. And I'm wondering what happens in his brain now, because the triggers are still there, no? I mean, he might have repositioned himself, but he still talks about the same issues. Mm. How does he do that? Does that maybe lead to a new way of rigid thinking to kind of make yourself less vulnerable, to set yourself apart from, to create a safe space?
That's really interesting. I think that usually when you leave a very ideological environment, you do have to have that immense plasticity and strength to do that. Because also when you leave an ideology, you're not just leaving an understanding of reality in the world, you're leaving people. And you're leaving family connections, you're leaving friends, you're leaving identities behind. And so it takes a lot of strength to be able to do that. But then you could also be in a vulnerable moment, because some people then take another ideology to the extreme, maybe the opposite one, and become very militant about that. But some people can stay in that space where they're, rather than seeing the world as black and white in a different way, they stay in the shades of gray. And I think that that's in many ways the pursuit of what we want to do, right? Is to, battle against those forces that are trying to pressure us into narrow worldviews, and find a way for that to be more balanced and independent and authentic, really, to ourselves.
Let's say you'll be able to create a blueprint of an authentic, free-thinking, flexible brain. Do you think it would be possible to teach it at school, have classes at school and teach kids how to acquire a brain like that?
Yeah, so I don't think there is a set of rules that you can have, routines that you can follow, because then they'll start to resemble an ideology. So you don't want to be so prescriptive.
Yeah.
But there are broad guidelines. And that's why towards the end of the book, I think about what each individual can do to cultivate that flexibility of thinking. And I think that we can bring it into schools. And I think it's almost important that we do, because I think now there is an understanding that we should cultivate critical thinking skills and what's called the digital literacy to help children understand how to navigate online and not to fall prey to misinformation. And all of that is really important. But flexible thinking does something else, which is it allows people to tolerate change, to tolerate uncertainty, to tolerate ambiguities. And that when you exercise that kind of capacity, that tolerance for change, and that capacity to adapt to nuances, I think that gives you a huge resilience. And I think we can do that with children. And we can do that by trying to focus on what it means to think flexibly. But we can also model and encourage flexible thinking in almost every discipline or every kind of topic that they're engaged with, right? Because in any, whether it's art class or music class, but also not in the arts, math, science, you can approach those disciplines or topics by teaching them a set of rules to follow and formulas to apply again and again and repeat. But you can also try to encourage them to think in that wide, expansive, flexible way, right? So that they're not just telling you all the things you can build with bricks, but they can think about a thing and mutate it and change it and come at it from many different angles. And I think that's something that's a kind of question about how people think, right? And that's why you can apply it to every domain a child or an adult is thinking about.
Could you also do that with kids who grow up in a religion? Because you said religion is like one of the most, most like one of the strongest forms of ideological education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that in many ways it's almost important that we should, right? That we should model and encourage, at least in a different setting, to think in a non-rule-based way, in a non-ritualistic way, to show that it's not all about repetition and following authority, but you can deviate, you can rebel, and we should encourage that, mental rebellion, that elasticity of thought, to encourage children to think in not just outside the box, but against the box, because maybe in other settings they are inside more restricted worldviews.
I have an entirely different question for you as a scientist, because I wanted to ask you about how you feel about the state of science and the public attitude towards science. Because in your book, you make it very clear that there's the brain, and the brain is responsible for everything. And when we die, the brain dies and we die and nothing is left. But religious people think, I die, my brain dies, and something will live on, my soul, my mind, whatever. And I wanted to ask you about this current trend of, emotions beat facts. Like what I feel is the actual truth and not the fact. Do you feel science is having a hard time right now?
I think it is, and I do worry about it a lot because people do devalue evidence and science, and sometimes that doesn't even have to come from an classic religious or ideological setting. It can also come from secular worldviews too, and people say, no, it's only lived experiences and personal suffering, and that's the currency that we should operate on, and just only activating our empathy towards each other, and that's the only way to fight polarization. But as a scientist, and a scientist of the brain, I know that the brain is this incredibly powerful organ that, yes, is tuned towards stories and emotions, but it's also tuned towards understanding the world rationally, right? And predicting the world and understanding reality, because our brains need to navigate the world. They need to survive in the world. And so we have this intrinsic motivation to model reality, to understand it in an accurate way. And I think we need to activate that kind of motivation that we have a lot more, because I think that when you give people a sense that the evidence that you're presenting is not just there to persuade them, but is there to allow them to survive in the world, to navigate it more successfully, more accurately, I think that's also something that people respond to. But I think sometimes people feel like scientists are trying to persuade, manipulate. There's all these more negative connotations where we maybe need to have a clear sense that it's about information, and that information is strength. And it's not, I think science has become very politicized right now in ways that it shouldn't be.
I wonder how that relates to this feeling we have right now of everything is chaos, aggression, and we almost feel like, I don't know, we seem to like it. I mean, rallies these days look like battlefields. I wonder if there is a connection, like this, like overkill of emotion and focus on empathy and stuff like that.
You know, when Elsa Frankel-Brunswick was doing these interviews with children, she noticed that the most prejudiced children, the most intolerant children, not only had a kind of rigidity of thought, they also tended to be obsessed with chaos and catastrophe.
Wow.
I know, it's really powerful. They kept on obsessing. They would tell these stories about apocalypses and the world ending.
Oh my God.
It's chilling, right?
Yes.
This is 1940s children, but you see that strain in current politics now. And so that obsession with chaos, catastrophe, doom, a dystopian kind of approach to life is a very, very powerful way to enter into a very dogmatic, ideological approach to the world. And that's scary.
Well, it only makes your work so much more valuable and important. To conclude this conversation, can I just ask you what's next for you? Do you already know? Can you share a bit of what you're working right now and what's to come?
Yes, I am so passionate about sharing these ideas because I think that they empower people on an individual level, right? Sometimes we think that we can only have that the only solutions to big problems come from big policies, big social structural changes. And that's often true. But I also, maybe because I'm a psychologist, I really believe in the power of the individual and the individual to change themselves, and that is a key way for progress, for social change to happen, that allows us to hopefully create a world that is more open to evidence, more open to debate and plurality, and that's a better world. So I'm passionate about that for now. And more exciting research and ideas and hopefully books to come.
Thank you so much for being with us here today. Thank you so much for this conversation, Leor.
It was a pleasure.
And, to our listeners, I'd just like to point out that, as always, we will include the link to Leor Zmigrod's book and other useful information in the show notes of this episode. And if you have any feedback for us or the author, please don't hesitate to drop us a line at podcast@surkamp.de. Thank you so much for listening. I hope your brains enjoyed it. Dichtung und Wahrheit ist ein Podcast der Verlage Surkamp und Insel, produziert von Bose Park Productions.